Hi, Ariana.
Hi, Tom. I like your glasses.
Oh, thank you. You look well too, considering we're in COVID lockdown times. Anyway, I'm here today with Ariana Neumann, who's a close friend of mine. Ariana is originally from Venezuela, now lives in London. She has written a very important new book that came out last year called When Time Stopped, which is really about her father's wartime experiences. Her father was quite a bit older than her. And the book is also about Ariana's kind of journey learning about them after her father passed away some 2 decades ago. And we'll speak about the book in a minute, but Ariana, let's just go back a second, because as I mentioned, you're actually Venezuelan, although we've only known each other since you've been in London. So just tell me, I mean, how was it to grow up in Venezuela? I know that it was a kind of richer country back when you were a child than it is today.
Well, it was, I mean, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and back then Venezuela was really a place of promise and potential. There was investment pouring in. The government was building schools, roads, museums. It really felt like a very vibrant, exciting place to be. And it was actually other countries in Latin America looked up to it as an example of what they could become. So it was pretty blissful, really. I mean, there was obviously, there was crime, there was social disparity, but nothing like what you have today. I mean, the Venezuela today is absolutely unrecognizable, of course. But the one I grew up in was just absolute bliss.
I know, I mean, what one sees on the news that there's something like 4 million Venezuelan refugees have gone over to neighboring countries and there's real poverty. And I remember you reminding me once when we were speaking that Concorde, the supersonic fast plane, if people remember that from British Airways, when it started off, I think in the 70s or late 70s, its destinations from London were New York, but also Caracas in Venezuela, which meant there were suitably wealthy people in Caracas to have Concorde flights back and forth.
And we had British Airways and Air France actually both flew the Concorde to Venezuela, so it was really quite astounding. And of course, it's completely ironic that you have 4 million people leaving Venezuela now, because in the post-war, Venezuela was one, and actually even during the war, Venezuela took Jewish refugees. So there's a famous boat in 1939, for example, that was refused in Barbados. 2 boats actually that filled with Jewish refugees, and they were denied entrance in Curacao and in Barbados, and Venezuela took them. And of course, after the war as well. So that's why my father ended up there.
Yeah, so Venezuela had, until fairly recently, a small but successful Jewish community. And indeed, when I say until recently, many of them have kind of fled for economic and other reasons to Florida and elsewhere. But Ariana, when you were growing up, you weren't aware you were Jewish, or you didn't, at least it wasn't spoken about, if that's what you've mentioned before. So just tell me briefly about your father and also your mother, how you saw them when you were a child rather than today.
So my father was a very successful industrialist. He was older, so he was older than the other dads around. He was in his 50s when he had me. And he was always busy. He was always doing exciting, interesting things. Which meant, of course, that it made perfect sense to me that he never spoke about the past, because his present was so exciting and so full of activity that, it didn't seem like he had time to sit there and talk to me about what had gone before. My mother, and my father was a bit of a Renaissance man, so he was an industrialist, but he was involved in educational reform, in museums, he really was an astounding man.
And he had a fantastic art collection, right? I mean, you've still got 1 or 2 of his pieces that I've seen myself in your home, and it's not just good art, it's also very interesting, bold choice of art, I would say.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't have some of the bolder pieces, mostly because they're huge naked women and I can't fit them at home. Might actually sort of ruin my children's social life if I did. But yes, he did. He had a marvelous art collection. And then my mother actually was also involved in art. She was the head of some theaters in Venezuela, and was very involved just with the ballet. Actually, she even started a ballet company in Venezuela. She's still around. She now lives in New York, and she's very involved with ballet still. But
I
they were
remember
quite
you saying
formidable.
she's on the board of New York City Ballet, if I remember
She
correctly.
is on the board of New York City Ballet, and she is the chairwoman of the New York Choreographic Institute. And I mean, again, she's won't tell you her age because she wouldn't like that, but she's still very, very busy. And they were quite formidable parents because they were dashing and fun and interesting, and busy and just fabulous parents to have.
Yeah, I know that you have 3 half siblings, but as far as I remember from when we've chatted, you didn't really grow up with any of them. So in a way, it was almost like being an only child. I mean, what was that how you felt, or was it difficult for
Um,
you? Yeah.
I think I don't think I really felt like an only child, but in the sense that I knew I had brothers, but on my father's side, I had a half brother. He was 20, almost 23 when I came along. So he was a grown up. And on my mother's side, she had been married before. I had two. They were 8 and 10 years older than me, and they lived with our father because when my mother had divorced, she had lost the right to raise them because it's a very chauvinistic, or it was a very chauvinistic place, Venezuela. Um, so my younger brothers would come on weekends, but and I was aware that they were mine. But for all practical purposes, I grew up in this beautiful house with huge, lush gardens and 3 giant guard dogs, all on my own, which made it sort of quite wonderful. A little lonely at times, so I read a lot for company.
Did you think you might end up writing an important book yourself when you were reading a lot as a child, or that's something?
No, but I was convinced I was going to solve an important mystery. So that I figured I would be a sort of young Agatha Christie, well, not an Agatha Christie, a young sort of Miss Marple, much younger Miss Marple, hopefully.
And that was indeed the mystery of your father's past, and we'll come to that just in a couple of minutes. But let's just quickly just do your life story slightly. I know that when you were about 13, you were sent off to school, to a boarding school in faraway Switzerland, in Lugano. I mean, it is far away from Venezuela, Switzerland, and those were, of course, the days before the internet, and it wasn't so easy staying in touch. Was it lonely or difficult to have been sent away, or maybe it was exciting?
It was all those things, and I had very parents wanted me to be independent. So actually from the age of 5, my mother would send me, she had French family, and she would send me off, I would get on Air France with one of these little tags around my neck saying lonely traveler. And I'm not sure I went on my own at 5, but I certainly went at 7 and crossed the ocean and spent my summers with my French cousins. So I was used to being on the other side of the ocean. And yet it was lonely and it was very difficult. And of course, the contrast between Switzerland and Venezuela, you go from the most chaotic and punctual place on the planet to the most punctual. And Lugano was, at least there was a little bit of that Italian flair. So it wasn't, I think if I had gone to Zurich, the shock would have been immense.
But Swiss Italian flair is not Italian flair, maybe.
No, it isn't Italian flair, but the people in Lugano would like to think it is Italian flair. Anyways, and it was, I suppose it was difficult, but you deal with what you're given, right? And it was.
Did you have any friends at that school, or you just went across?
I did, yeah. And actually, it was pretty wonderful because in Venezuela I led a very protected life, so I never, stupid things, but I'd never went to the supermarket in Venezuela. I never got on a bus, and as soon as I got to Lugano, of course, it was a completely different, smaller city. It's completely safe. And, just the fact that I could get on the bus and go downtown from Montañola, which is actually where Hermann Hesse lived. So the school is in this beautiful little village within Lugano. And, we'd just go down the hill on the bus and go to Burger King and go to the Migros, which was a supermarket. And that was an adventure. So I learned to be independent. And again, it was an American school, different times, but we would travel on weekends from the age of 16. So, you could, as long as you handed in a little form on Thursday saying where you were going to be staying, and they had a hotel name and a phone number, and you were back on Sunday, you pretty much could go anywhere that a train would take you to. So it was marvelous.
So anyway, and then you went, of course, to study after school at university in Tufts on the east coast of the US. now your English is probably the language you use all the time. Or I know that, you know, you speak it, of course, with your husband and kids and so on, and not Spanish or French or Italian. So, I mean, English preference. But how was it culturally moving to America? Was that another culture altogether than Venezuela and Europe? Or did you fit right in?
You know, I think I fitted right in. I mean, Boston is so international and it's such a student town, and I was a student. And then again, after that, I went to New York, and again, I had family. I had my mother had moved to New York, and I had been going to New York throughout. So that wasn't really a huge shock. And I think, again, it's, you know, it's different than Switzerland, New York for sure, and Boston, much bigger and much more international. But it wasn't a huge shock. I think the big cultural shock came when I went from New York to London.
Right.
Um,
So you
and
won't just remind people, because I know, but why London? You've already lived in the 3 or 4 countries. Why do you want to go to another one now?
exactly, well, I think I probably had too much sun in my life, and I wanted some rain and grey misery. No, London, because I actually thought I would go back to Venezuela, and my father was involved in newspapers, and I thought I would go back and work in newspapers in Venezuela. And I don't know if you know this, I'm sure you do, Tom, actually. Of course, England is the place, or the UK is the place with the most newspapers per capita.
Right.
And I thought I would come here and find a job in a newspaper here, which I eventually did at the European, back when it was Andrew Neil.
Back when Britain was part of Europe.
Well, yeah, well, a long time.
Newspaper
Yeah,
called the European.
a little bit
Back then, yeah.
too early for its time, really, and now it's completely too late, obviously, for the European. But it was an very
as I know, your father, who was very successful all the time in business, he actually owned one of the main newspapers in Venezuela. So maybe he wanted to get some kind of training on Fleet Street, as it used to be known in the British media, and then maybe return to Venezuela with your knowledge of working as a journalist in London, and maybe help out with Venezuelan media to keep democracy alive in Venezuela. But just moving forward, because I know you met Andrew, your husband, about then, and then you decided that sort of kept you in London in a way, of course. Or
well, I mean, Venezuela, it was a combination of things. I mean, my father died. Venezuela, I mean, Chavez was already in power, and the country didn't seem to be going in the right direction in terms of crime and in terms of politics, really. And it started becoming a more dangerous place to live. My father had actually started the main opposition newspaper with a Russian Jew called Theodor Bitkov, the main opposition newspaper to the Chavez regime, and that actually made it more dangerous for him and for me with his last name. And then, of course, I met Andrew, and he's an English barrister, and that's not the easiest profession in the world to go to travel with.
Right.
But I did say to him, a condition of our marriage was that he would take the New York bar and that we would go back to New York, which he did do. And then
happened? I can't remember.
It happened. He did take the New York bar. He passed it with flying colors, and I then thought, we went to New York when he went to collect his whatever it is, his diploma. And I thought, actually, it's rather grey, and I'm not sure I want to raise children here. I quite like the parks in London, and maybe we should stay. By then we had one and another one on the way. So,
and of course, this is a very important time, which leads us, it's the beginning of what leads to your book almost 2 decades later, because I remember that essentially around the time of the 9/11 attacks in 2001, you're obviously, the whole of the world changes, at least at the time, and with travel and everything. But for your personal life, your father passed away in Venezuela almost a couple of days before or after 9/11. And if I remember you telling me, you couldn't even, there was an international air ban, you couldn't even go straight away to the funeral. Is that right? I can't remember now.
Yes, no, I mean, yes, it was my father died on September the 9th. And I actually couldn't travel to Venezuela. So you're absolutely right about that. Not because there was
you were pregnant, that's right.
I was pregnant. I was 3 weeks from giving birth, and I was told that I couldn't go back. And then, of course, and his funeral was actually on 9/11. So I was, I was mourning my father, and then, very aware my mother was in New York, and my stepfather actually worked at Merrill Lynch just in front of the Twin Towers downtown. So I was obviously, the twin.
It was a very life-changing week, not just for
It
for
was.
New York, but for you in particular. So Ariana, we won't go into too much detail because people who haven't read your book may want to get it, but just very briefly, as I know from having read it and so on and talked to you about it a lot, after he died and you eventually managed to go to Venezuela after you'd given birth and a little while later, he had left you a single box. Just very briefly tell us what I mean by that and why that's the beginning of the spark that led to your book.
So, I mean, my father was a collector of things, and he kept every piece of paper that he always had. And in January, 3 months after he died, I went back to Venezuela, and I had set aside a couple of weeks because I figured it would take me weeks through, at least, to sort out through all the papers and figure out what to keep and what to throw away. And when I got there, and my father died having had a series of strokes, so he knew the end was coming. I got there and I opened all the doors to his office, which should have been crammed with papers, and it was all completely empty. It had been cleaned out. And the only thing that there was in any of these drawers was actually a small file with some of my letters that I had sent to him and some of the letters that my mother had sent to him throughout the romance and afterwards when they were friends after their divorce. And then a box, and this marvelous box, marvelous because I mean, it just meant so much.
You mean a treasure for you is what you really mean.
It was a treasure. I had found it as a child detective when I was 9 years old. And when I had found it the first time in 1980, I was absolutely terrified because it included a photograph, an ID card with a photograph of my father, a stamp of Hitler, but it was made not in my father's name, which was Hans Neumann, but in someone else's name entirely. And I mean, it really just discombobulated me. And I think that was when I realized that there was a mystery to my father.
Sorry to interrupt for 1 second. If it's within reach, because I've shown it before, is it in the cupboard that's right next to you, just there?
It is, I mean, if you don't mind me
just
getting
quickly get it. Just quickly go and get it, just to show what you found in it dramatically.
Okay, absolutely. Hold on 1 second, Tom.
Okay. But we'll just hang on here for Ariana. Don't go away, anyone. You can look at her bookshelf behind, which I know she's got other books and art in the other room. Okay, she's back.
And back
so
with
you find this box and you have seen it before. This is what you find in it.
And it wasn't in those days, it wasn't in sort of
no, you put it in protective.
archive.
You put it in protective.
But now this is what I found.
Yeah.
And it's what I found in 1980. And of course, I mean, the key bit there, I don't know if you can see it, is the part that says Jan Sebesta.
Yeah, so it's a completely different name than your father's name. It was also a different birthday. You also have a picture of Hitler. You can see the stamp of Hitler underneath the photo of your father. So you didn't know what was going on. I mean, could he have even been a Nazi, heaven forbid? You know.
Absolutely. And I mean, so I was really terrified. I now know this is an official ID card, but it's obviously in a fake name. And it made no sense because all I knew as I was growing up really about my father was that he had emigrated in 1949, that he had been born in Prague.
From post-war Czechoslovakia.
From post-war Czechoslovakia. He had emigrated with his brother Lothar.
Wait, keep your box, because I want to you just see what else, the yellow, okay. Yeah, go on, sorry.
So he had emigrated with his brother Lothar. And then that was it. He never ever spoke about the past. He never spoke about religion. I was raised as a Catholic because my mother was a Catholic. And really, what came before me was a mystery, and certainly what came before 1949 was a mystery. And when you grow up with someone that is traumatized, I think you very quickly learn that you cannot ask questions. You learn that there are sort of no-go areas. So I didn't really ask very many questions, but my father knew, because I did ask some, that I wanted to solve. I wanted to know. I wanted to find out. I wanted to find out any detail that I could about his life during the war, about his life before. And I think leaving me this box was his way of saying, here you go. Here is what I have of the past. This is what I can share with you. And you now have permission to go and research it.
And it obviously was too painful for him to do that while he was alive, which is why, as you said before, he basically shredded or got rid of everything else, but left you that very personal poignant box, which, as you've shown it before, also the yellow stars. Have you got them to hand?
Yes, I do. And it,
Incredible.
actually, the yellow stars were not in my box, but they were in Lotter, my uncle's box. And my cousin sent them to me. And I mean, if
We'll just show them if you,
they're absolutely, I mean, I don't know if people have seen these, and these were my family's stars. And I think what I found most horrific are the ones that are missing. It's the ones that have been scissored out and that were attached to
they were given them in Prague, and each member of the family, by the Nazi laws, had to put a star on them. That's right. Yes,
correct. And they had to be sewn, so you had to buy, and you actually had to buy them. I don't know if you know this, but you had to purchase them. So they took away your livelihood, they took away your belongings, you couldn't work, you barely had any, you know, your food was rationed, you barely had any money to buy food in the first place. And then you were made to buy stars that you then had to cut. I mean, they're quite remarkable. I don't know if you can see it, but they're almost like, you know, there's a little bit so that you know where to cut, so that you can then have enough room to attach it to your chest.
And of course, for anyone watching who doesn't know, it's not just wearing a star. You were forbidden entry to public parks, to shops. You weren't allowed to be on one side of the street. You couldn't go to certain schools, hospitals, office buildings. One by one, they introduced all kind of prohibitory laws. The Holocaust wasn't just about carting people off to be killed. There was an entire process of dehumanization and restrictive laws. And of course, Czech Jews were Czech citizens. These aren't, it didn't matter whether you were religious or an atheist. This all, you know, there was no one was let off, or people, often not of Czech Jews, were only half Jewish or even a quarter Jewish, but they were still by and large deported. So anyway, so you discovered all this. So you had, you know, I think we can say a fairly good childhood, because your father was very successful. And like you say, you were born up, you were from a prominent Venezuelan family, and like most families, Catholic. You're suddenly intimately connected to what I would argue is the worst crime of the 20th century, possibly the worst crime ever by some criteria. So how did you feel? I mean, what happened in your mind and emotions?
Oh, well, I mean, it's been sort of 20 years of the most horrific and yet the most wonderful journey, because what happened is, of course, I found out all these horrors and injustices that my family went through. But I also discovered this, you know, 34 members of my father's family that I had never heard about. And
distant cousins that are still alive that you've managed to connect with.
So out of the 34, 29 were deported to camps. 25 didn't come back, but 4 did come back and had children. So I have discovered cousins in California, in Israel, in the Czech Republic. And I've actually traced people that helped my father survive.
You're forgetting that we're distant cousins too, but
we are distant cousins, absolutely. You're one of them.
Anyway, you also discovered that your father's parents, your grandparents, had, you know, been deported from Theresienstadt to Terezin, which is the camp north of Prague, to Auschwitz, where they were murdered. So, I mean, had your father mentioned his parents at all, or you just never really talked about them or asked?
We didn't really talk about them very much. I mean, there was one photograph, a very faded picture of, you know, a very sad picture really of 2 people sitting around a table. And it was pretty small, and it was by his bedside. And if you ever asked my father about his family, about my grandparents, he would start to shake. So, and he had never mentioned anything really. I mean, by the time he died, I knew that they had died during the war. And obviously by then I had gone to Prague and seen this incredible question mark in the Pinka synagogue next to my father's name. So I knew that they had died at the hand of the Nazis. But no, I had no idea. And one of the most incredible things I have is another box that came my way, which is filled with letters from my grandparents, because they were in Theresienstadt for 2 years. And they had a system of contraband by where my father and his brother snuck supplies into the camp, and out came these letters. So through reading these letters, I've gotten to know my beautiful grandparents, actually.
Yeah, I mean,
so the journey has been Sorry, no, no.
Just telling people who don't know, Theresienstadt, though hellish and 35,000 people died there, it wasn't quite as bad as some of the other death camps. And therefore, some people, not all there, had some degree of normalcy in the sense that your grandparents, before being murdered, had been able to write letters and you managed to get hold of them later. And just explaining to people that it's a relative rarity of people sent to camps. And my own family, many of whom were in camps, certainly didn't manage to write any letters. But that's, you know, you managed to get hold of the letters and discover these grandparents who your father hadn't even mentioned. So that, in a way, is something.
No, it was, I mean, it is wonderful. And I mean, actually, Theresienstadt was the propaganda camp. Yeah. So it's the one that they showed, you know, and they actually built it as a retirement community. And it was a pretty horrific place, but of course there was no gas chambers. And actually my grandparents' letters are filled with little notes saying, you know, we just need to avoid being transported. They were coded, the letters, of course. Yeah. They weren't censored, but they were coded because you never knew who would read them. So they said, we just need to avoid being sent on holiday to the east. And of course,
although sorry to interrupt, I was just reading today as somebody I met, Otto Dovkulka, who's a Czech-born Auschwitz survivor in Israel. He just died, and he said they went from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz, and his father said, we volunteered to get on the train because it was so crowded at Theresienstadt, we thought it might be less crowded there. So it's, you know, obviously they were being lied to, but Theresienstadt, it's true that the Red Cross, you know, were invited in, and for some people for a limited time there was some normalcy, but it was also pretty hellish and many people were killed there.
And you know that they sent 7,000 out to clear the camp out before the Red Cross came over, and there were 7,000 that were within, you know, they were just sent out and gassed. Sure.
Ariana, I know we haven't got too much more time, unfortunately, but just quickly, I mean, what's, you know, has it been an increasing process to think about the Holocaust these 20 years more and more, or you know, it's how, or to decide to write a book about it, or?
It's something that I don't think that it ever, you know, if once you discover that you have, you know, that you're intricately tied to it. And I think I always knew somehow, at a cellular level, I think trauma is passed down, despite the silences, despite the fact that my father didn't share any of this really. And I think it becomes a part of you really. And I do, having not known anything about my family and what happened to them for the, you know, half of my life, I do now feel a duty to tell people about it, to tell them about my beautiful family, but also to tell them about the horrors that happened to them. And it is, you know, obviously I'm a second generation, and I'm so lucky to be alive. And the least I can do is just tell people and remind them of the horrors that apparently civilized humans are capable of.
And also, just to be fair to your father, today there is quite a lot of interest in the Holocaust. There are quite a lot of films, books, museums, Holocaust Memorial Day, but all this is relatively recent. For decades after the Holocaust, many survivors, and just to tell people, your father wasn't actually in a camp. He managed to hide and escape and so on, but people can read about that in the book. But he is a survivor in essence, even though he wasn't deported to a camp. Many survivors didn't or couldn't psychologically, or didn't want to talk about it, or didn't want to their children to be burdened with that pain, so they try not to speak about it. So it was very common in the decades after the Holocaust for people not to talk about it. People today might think it's unusual, but actually your father's situation wasn't so unusual in not talking about it.
No, absolutely. And you know, it's one of the people that I traced is a cousin of mine, who grew up in Czechoslovakia. And in 1959, she was trying to get to school, and she was actually banned from school. So this is right after the war. She was banned from going to school in the town that she grew up in the outskirts of Prague, because she was a Jew. So anti-Semitism was very well and rife, even 50 years after the war ended.
There were showgrounds of Jews in communist Czechoslovakia. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
So it really, you know, anyways, it's not that sort. I mean, my father was very traumatized, and I think he felt very guilty because he escaped from 3 transports effectively, or he managed to avoid being transported 3 times. The Gestapo is looking for him. And instead of going to join his family, he decides that the only way to survive the war is by doing the unthinkable and baffling the Nazis by going to hide in plain sight in Berlin. But I think as brilliant a plan as that turned out to be, it also filled him with immense guilt. So I don't think he could talk about it and share this past. But also, why, as you say, why would you? Why, people weren't that interested, and you didn't want to sort of call attention to the fact that you were Jewish, as it had killed most of your family, and there was still anti-Semitism in Europe, certainly.
But even those survivors who did want to write about it couldn't get published. Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, they couldn't find publishers. It's only decades later that there's suddenly so many books being published and so many films made, and people just even talk about it. People, even in Israel, survivors, often people are like, let's just get on with the future and the present and not dwell on the past. So people, even the survivors that did speak, it maybe added to the pain that no one really wanted to listen. So, or not no one, but too many people didn't want to.
And Tom, there's also, still when I was looking to, this didn't start out as a book, it started out as a personal journey of discovery, but eventually in 2017, I thought, I have to tell these stories. And I was met with a lot of, my agent was absolutely wonderful, but a lot of publishers went, oh, it's another Holocaust book. As if, and I think as long as there is, one anti-Semite out there, there aren't enough Holocaust books.
Well, I have to say, not just anti-Semites, it's important for the entire world, not just Jews, to understand what a civilized society like Germany and Austria was capable of. No one should ever forget that. It's not just about Jews or indeed about Germans and Austrians. We've never learned enough about it, in my view. The more books, the better. And I know you said you have to go shortly, somebody's coming or something, but your book certainly adds to the important set of Holocaust books. So
I'm very kind, Tom. I'm very grateful. You were an early reader, so I'm particularly grateful to you for that. Thank you, Tom. It's been a real joy to speak to you, and I hope to see you soon and when times are gentler.
Yes. Okay. Hope to see you soon too. Okay. Bye.
Bye, Tom.